A millionaire offers a homeless woman a deal to carry his child, but when the baby is born, he is left utterly speechless by what he sees. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below with the city you're watching from. Enjoy the journey, everyone. Harrison Lewis was a 42-year-old man who had it all: wealth, power, and influence. Yet, that night, as he sat in his sprawling mansion surrounded by opulence, a stark realization dawned on him. Despite everything he had amassed, there was one thing his fortune could not buy: an heir. He needed a child. But Harrison had no interest in building a family the conventional way. He had walked down that road twice before, only to watch both marriages crumble into failure and regret. Love, he believed, was an illusion, an unpredictable force that only led to complications. A child, however, was different. A child was an investment, a legacy, the continuation of everything he had painstakingly built. Determined to avoid emotional entanglements, he sought a solution that was purely transactional, clear, simple, and contractual. With his resources, he knew it wouldn't be difficult to find someone willing to carry a pregnancy under his terms. No strings, no expectations, just a deal. For Harrison, this was nothing more than a business arrangement, and like every other deal he had made, he intended to maintain complete control. Now all he needed was the right person to agree to his proposition. The next morning, Harrison Lewis cruised through the city streets in his sleek sports car. Yet, his mind was elsewhere, preoccupied with finding the perfect candidate. As he pulled up to a red light near downtown, something unusual caught his eye. On the corner of the sidewalk, a young woman sat cross-legged on the ground, sketching on a tattered piece of paper. Her disheveled brown hair fell in loose strands over her face, and despite the weariness in her expression, her piercing blue eyes gleamed with quiet intensity. She seemed invisible to the world, overlooked by the passers-by, but something about her held Harrison's gaze. He tried to shake the thought away, dismissing it as irrelevant. Yet, as the traffic light turned green, he stole another glance and wondered, who sits on the sidewalk and draws as if nothing else matters? Irritated with himself, he pressed the accelerator and sped off, leaving her behind. But the further he drove, the more a nagging thought gnawed at him. A few blocks later, he pulled into an empty parking lot, gripping the steering wheel in contemplation. This is absurd, he told himself, and yet, an inexplicable instinct urged him to go back. Frustrated, yet unable to ignore the impulse, he turned the car around and retraced his route. And there she was. Exactly as before, now leaning her paper against the brick wall, completely absorbed in her art. Harrison pulled up beside her, rolling down his window with an air of authority. His voice was sharp, direct. "You! Come here!" The young woman lifted her gaze, suspicion flickering in her tired blue eyes. She studied the well-dressed man in the luxury car, her expression wary. "I'm not asking. Come on, I don't have all day," he pressed, his tone unwavering. Slowly, with evident reluctance, she rose to her feet and stepped toward the car. As she drew closer, her frailty became even more apparent, the hollowness of her cheeks, the exhaustion in her posture. Harrison took a measured breath. She'll do, he thought. But he had no idea just how much this decision would change everything. Despite everything, there was something in her posture, the way she held herself, the way she met his gaze without fear. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Harrison studied her for a moment, his sharp eyes scanning her face, searching for something, perhaps hesitation, perhaps defiance. "Get in, I'll take you somewhere we can talk," he said finally, his tone leaving little room for argument. She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "If you're looking for company, you've got the wrong girl. I'm not one of those." His expression hardened, clearly irritated by the assumption. "Don't be ridiculous. I don't have time for that. I just want to talk. Now get in the car, or stay here and keep living on that sidewalk." The hesitation in her eyes lingered, but there was something in his authoritative presence, something that made refusal feel pointless. Finally, with a quiet sigh, she pulled the door open and slid into the passenger seat. The silence inside the car was thick, heavy with unspoken questions. But if Harrison noticed, he didn't acknowledge it. He simply drove, his focus locked on the road ahead. Minutes later, they arrived at a quiet cafe tucked away from the city's noise. Harrison parked and stepped out, waiting as she followed reluctantly. Once inside, he chose a secluded corner table. He looked around and selected a table that seemed to reach. She sat across from him, her wary blue eyes locked onto his. "What's your name?" he asked as he leaned back in his chair. "Lea Parker," she answered. "But why does that matter?" "Because I need to know who I'm dealing with," he replied smoothly. His gaze didn't waver as he continued. "Tell me, Lea, why do you sit on the sidewalk drawing as if nothing else exists?" She shrugged, avoiding his eyes. "What else is there to do? I have nowhere to go. I lost everything, but that's none of your business." Harrison leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his fingers laced together. "Fair enough," he said. "Then let's get to the point. I have an offer for you. One that could change your life." Lea's eyes narrowed. "And what exactly would that be?" He exhaled, his expression unreadable. "I want you to have a child for me." For a moment, she simply blinked, as if the words hadn't fully registered. Then, she let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You're joking, right?" "No," he said evenly. "I'm completely serious. I'll cover all your expenses, ensure you have everything you need during the pregnancy, and when it's over, you'll receive a sum of money that will guarantee you never have to struggle again." Lea scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest. "This has to be some kind of sick joke. What kind of man makes an offer like that to a complete stranger?" "The kind of man who knows what he wants and doesn't waste time," Harrison replied without hesitation. His voice was as cold and calculated as ever. "I don't want a relationship. I don't want emotions. I just want a child. Nothing more. Nothing less." Lea stared at Harrison as if he had lost his mind. His words echoed in her head, loud and relentless. "I want you to have my child." She wanted to laugh, to dismiss his proposal as absurd, but something in his unwavering gaze told her he was completely serious. There was no hesitation, no doubt, only cold, calculated certainty. And that, more than anything, unsettled her. His logic hit her like a force she hadn't prepared for, leaving her torn between two brutal realities: her dignity and her survival. "This is insanity," she finally said, breaking the silence. "No woman in her right mind would agree to something like this." Harrison didn't flinch. He remained composed, his expression unreadable, his presence commanding. "No woman in your position would refuse," he countered smoothly. "I'm offering you a way out. Comfort, stability, a fresh start, in exchange for something you already have, the ability to bear a child." Lea folded her arms across her chest, her posture defensive. She wanted to believe she had the upper hand, but deep down she knew he was right. Every day for her was a battle, against hunger, against exhaustion, against the crushing weight of nothingness. Yet, the thought of selling something so deeply personal, so intrinsically hers, for money made her stomach churn. "And then what?" she asked, her voice laced with skepticism. "What happens after the baby is born?" Harrison exhaled, leaning back slightly in his chair, as if he had expected the question. "After the baby is born, you'll receive a substantial sum, enough to start over, to build a life for yourself. No strings attached. You'll be free to go wherever you want, do whatever you want." Lea let out a short, humorless laugh. "No strings attached," she repeated, shaking her head. "And how do I know you won't change your mind later? Drag me into court, take everything away from me." He studied her carefully, his gaze piercing before replying. "Lea, I'm a businessman. I don't enter into agreements without ensuring that all parties benefit. You'll have a legally binding contract, ironclad. Neither of us will be able to alter the terms once it's signed." For a moment, silence stretched between them. She let his words settle, weighing them against the cold reality she had been living. The promise of security, even if temporary, was tempting. More than tempting. She had nothing, not even a place to sleep that night. But she also knew she was standing at the edge of a precipice, staring down at a decision that could change everything. "And what if I say no?" she challenged, leaning forward slightly. A faint smile ghosted across Harrison's lips. "Then you go back to the streets. You keep scraping by, fighting the cold and the hunger. The choice is yours." His words landed like a punch to the gut. She wanted to hate him for being so brutally direct, but what she hated more was that he was right. He had backed her into a corner and they both knew it. But there was one more thing she needed to ask. "Why are you doing this?" Lea demanded, her voice edged with both frustration and disbelief. "A man like you with all your money? Why not just adopt a child, or find one of those rich women who parade their perfect families like trophies? Harrison exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his tone was devoid of warmth, stripped down to cold logic. Because I want something that's mine, an heir of my own blood. Adoption brings complications, legal battles, uncertainties. And as for women in my social circle, getting involved with them means dealing with egos, expectations, and emotional baggage I have no interest in. I want control, Lea, nothing more, nothing less. The bluntness of his words sent a chill through her. She looked away, unsettled. He wasn't lying, that was what made it worse. His honesty only made her feel more exposed, more vulnerable. She swallowed, forcing herself to think rationally. I need time to think. Harrison studied her for a brief moment, then gave a small nod, as if he had anticipated this response. You have 24 hours, he said coolly. After that, don't bother contacting me. And with that, he stood up, walking toward the door without another word. Lea sat frozen for a moment, watching as he disappeared. It felt as if she had been caught in a storm, one that threatened to pull her in before she even knew which way the wind was blowing. As she wandered the streets, her thoughts raced. Comfort. Stability. A new life. The words clung to her mind, refusing to let go. She knew all too well what it meant to have nothing. The biting cold wrapped around her like an unwelcome embrace, a reminder that tomorrow would bring the same struggles. Hunger gnawing at her stomach, the exhaustion of never having a safe place to rest, the humiliation of being unseen, ignored by a world that had already decided she didn't matter. She sat on a worn park bench, staring at the sky, overcast and indifferent. Her mother used to say that opportunities only knock once. It was up to you whether to seize them or let them slip away. But at what cost? Having a child, even as part of a business deal, was not something she had ever imagined. But what if this was her only chance to escape the cycle of misery? Meanwhile, miles away in his penthouse, Harrison sat in his dimly lit living room, reviewing a meticulously drafted contract his lawyers had prepared. He hated waiting, but he was pragmatic enough to know that Lea didn't have many choices. If she declined, he would move on to someone else. Simple as that. The sharp buzz of the intercom interrupted his thoughts. He picked it up, hearing his receptionist's voice. Sir, Lea Parker is here. His grip tightened slightly around the receiver. He hadn't expected her so soon. Send her up, he replied, his tone neutral. Minutes later, the door opened. Lea stepped inside, her posture tense but unwavering. Her blue eyes, exhausted yet resolute, met his without flinching. She said bluntly, her voice steady. Harrison rose from his chair, his gaze assessing her. No hesitation, no second guessing, just firm, undeniable certainty. Great. Let's make this official, Harrison said, motioning for her to sit while he picked up the contract from the table. Lea hesitated before lowering herself into the chair, her fingers tightening slightly as she reached for the document. She read through the terms carefully. Everything was laid out in precise, clinical detail. She would be taken care of throughout the pregnancy, all her expenses covered, and, in the end, she would receive a substantial sum to rebuild her life. In return, she would relinquish all rights to the child. This seems final, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. That's exactly what I want, Harrison replied, his tone unwavering. And I hope it's what you want too. Lea exhaled slowly. A part of her screamed to walk away, to pretend this moment had never happened. But reality had never been kind to her. For the first time in a long time, she had an option, one that offered something more than just surviving day to day. With a steadying breath, she picked up the pen. The ink glided smoothly across the page as she signed her name, sealing a deal that would alter both their lives forever. The weight of the contract settled over her, heavier than she had anticipated. This wasn't just a signature. It was a turning point. That same day, Harrison's assistant Sienna arrived to escort her. A sleek black car idled outside the building's entrance, waiting to take her away from the life she had known. As the city blurred past the window, Lea felt an odd detachment, as if she were watching someone else's story unfold. The streets, once an endless maze of struggle, now seemed to hold something different. A possibility a path leading somewhere unknown. The silence in the car was thick, but Sienna, seemingly used to working in an environment of cold transactions, attempted to ease it. "You'll like the place," she said with a polite smile. "It's quiet, spacious, and most importantly, comfortable." The warmth in her tone felt out of place against the sterile nature of the contract Lea had just signed. She only nodded, still processing the rapid shift her life had taken in a matter of hours. When the car finally pulled up to the estate, Leah's breath caught in her throat. Towering iron gates slowly creaked open, revealing a breathtaking property surrounded by meticulously maintained gardens. At its heart stood the mansion, a formidable structure of marble and glass, pristine yet unwelcoming, much like the man who owned it. Yet, the thought of selling something so deeply personal, so intrinsically hers, for money made her stomach churn. "And then what?" she asked, her voice laced with skepticism. "What happens after the baby is born?" Harrison exhaled, leaning back slightly in his chair, as if he had expected the question. "After the baby is born, you'll receive a substantial sum, enough to start over, to build a life for yourself. No strings attached. You'll be free to go wherever you want, do whatever you want." Lea let out a short, humorless laugh. "No strings attached," she repeated, shaking her head. "And how do I know you won't change your mind later? Drag me into court, take everything away from me." He studied her carefully, his gaze piercing before replying. "Lea, I'm a businessman. I don't enter into agreements without ensuring that all parties benefit. You'll have a legally binding contract, ironclad. Neither of us will be able to alter the terms once it's signed." For a moment, silence stretched between them. She let his words settle, weighing them against the cold reality she had been living. The promise of security, even if temporary, was tempting. More than tempting. She had nothing, not even a place to sleep that night. But she also knew she was standing at the edge of a precipice, staring down at a decision that could change everything. "And what if I say no?" she challenged, leaning forward slightly. A faint smile ghosted across Harrison's lips. "Then you go back to the streets. You keep scraping by, fighting the cold and the hunger. The choice is yours." His words landed like a punch to the gut. She wanted to hate him for being so brutally direct, but what she hated more was that he was right. He had backed her into a corner and they both knew it, but there was one more thing she needed to ask. "Why are you doing this?" Lea demanded, her voice edged with both frustration and disbelief. "A man like you with all your money? Why not just adopt a child, or find one of those rich women who parade their perfect families like trophies?" Harrison exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his tone was devoid of warmth, stripped down to cold logic. "Because I want something that's mine, an heir of my own blood. Adoption brings complications, legal battles, uncertainties. And as for women in my social circle, getting involved with them means dealing with egos, expectations, and emotional baggage I have no interest in. I want control, Lea, nothing more, nothing less." The bluntness of his words sent a chill through her. She looked away, unsettled. He wasn't lying, that was what made it worse. His honesty only made her feel more exposed, more vulnerable. She swallowed, forcing herself to think rationally. "I need time to think." Harrison studied her for a brief moment, then gave a small nod, as if he had anticipated this response. "You have 24 hours, he said coolly. "After that, don't bother contacting me." And with that, he stood up, walking toward the door without another word. Lea sat frozen for a moment, watching as he disappeared. It felt as if she had been caught in a storm, one that threatened to pull her in before she even knew which way the wind was blowing. As she wandered the streets, her thoughts raced. Comfort. Stability. A new life. The words clung to her mind, refusing to let go. She knew all too well what it meant to have nothing. The biting cold wrapped around her like an unwelcome embrace, a reminder that tomorrow would bring the same struggles. Hunger gnawing at her stomach, the exhaustion of never having a safe place to rest, the humiliation of being unseen, ignored by a world that had already decided she didn't matter. She sat on a worn park bench, staring at the sky, overcast and indifferent. Her mother used to say that opportunities only knock once. It was up to you whether to seize them or let them slip away. but at what cost? Having a child, even as part of a business deal, was not something she had ever imagined. But what if this was her only chance to escape the cycle of misery? Meanwhile, miles away in his penthouse, Harrison sat in his dimly lit living room, reviewing a meticulously drafted contract his lawyers had prepared. He hated waiting, but he was pragmatic enough to know that Lea didn't have many choices. If she declined, he would move on to someone else. Simple as that. The sharp buzz of the intercom interrupted his thoughts. He picked it up, hearing his receptionist's voice. "Sir, Lea Parker is here." His grip tightened slightly around the receiver. He hadn't expected her so soon. "Send her up," he replied, his tone neutral. Minutes later, the door opened. Lea stepped inside, her posture tense but unwavering. Her blue eyes, exhausted yet resolute, met his without flinching. She said bluntly, her voice steady. Harrison rose from his chair, his gaze assessing her. No hesitation, no second-guessing, just firm, undeniable certainty. "Great. Let's make this official," Harrison said, motioning for her to sit while he picked up the contract from the table. Lea hesitated before lowering herself into the chair, her fingers tightening slightly as she reached for the document. She read through the terms carefully. Everything was laid out in precise, clinical detail. She would be taken care of throughout the pregnancy, all her expenses covered, and, in the end, she would receive a substantial sum to rebuild her life. In return, she would relinquish all rights to the child. "This seems final," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's exactly what I want," Harrison replied, his tone unwavering. "And I hope it's what you want too." Lea exhaled slowly. A part of her screamed to walk away, to pretend this moment had never happened. But reality had never been kind to her. For the first time in a long time, she had an option, one that offered something more than just surviving day to day. With a steadying breath, she picked up the pen. The ink glided smoothly across the page as she signed her name, sealing a deal that would alter both their lives forever. The weight of the contract settled over her, heavier than she had anticipated. This wasn't just a signature. It was a turning point. That same day, Harrison's assistant Sienna arrived to escort her. A sleek black car idled outside the building's entrance, waiting to take her away from the life she had known. As the city blurred past the window, Lea felt an odd detachment, as if she were watching someone else's story unfold. The streets, once an endless maze of struggle, now seemed to hold something different. A possibility. A path leading somewhere unknown. The silence in the car was thick, but Sienna, seemingly used to working in an environment of cold transactions, attempted to ease it. "You'll like the place," she said with a polite smile. "It's quiet, spacious, and most importantly, comfortable." The warmth in her tone felt out of place against the sterile nature of the contract Lea had just signed. She only nodded, still processing the rapid shift her life had taken in a matter of hours. When the car finally pulled up to the estate, Lea's breath caught in her throat. Towering iron gates slowly creaked open, revealing a breathtaking property surrounded by meticulously maintained gardens. At its heart stood the mansion, a formidable structure of marble and glass, pristine yet unwelcoming, much like the man who owned it. Stepping out of the car, she followed Sienna inside, barely able to absorb the extravagance surrounding her. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting a golden glow on the wide marble staircases. The furniture looked like it had been pulled from the pages of an exclusive design catalog, polished, expensive, and utterly detached from anything she had ever known. She didn't belong here. Sienna led her through the grand halls, offering another reassuring smile. "I'll show you to your room," she said, pausing slightly before adding, "It's one of the best suites in the house." Lea followed in silence, her mind too overwhelmed to form a response. The bedroom was unlike anything she had ever seen. A massive bed dressed in crisp linen sheets dominated the space, framed by floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the room in soft golden light. The adjoining bathroom was larger than any apartment she had ever lived in. Everything gleamed, untouched and perfect. "If you need anything, just call me. We're here to take care of you," Sienna said gently before stepping out, leaving Lea alone with the silence. She sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers across the smooth fabric of the sheets. Just last night, She had been curled up on a cold sidewalk, the chill of the pavement pressing into her bones. Now she was surrounded by warmth, comfort, luxury, and yet it felt suffocating. Because no matter how soft the bed was, no matter how grand the house, she wasn't a guest. She was a transaction, a signed deal, a temporary piece of a carefully calculated plan. And that was something she could never forget. In the days that followed, Lea tried to adjust to her new reality. Her days were structured, almost rigid. Meals were served promptly, a team of doctors had been hired to conduct initial exams, and every detail of her well-being was meticulously monitored. As expected, Harrison remained distant. He was consumed by work, rarely making an appearance around the house except to review the reports Sienna provided on Lea's progress. Their interactions were minimal, almost non-existent. But on one of those rare occasions, their paths unexpectedly crossed. Lea had just finished a medical appointment when she spotted Harrison walking toward her down the hallway, his posture as impeccable as ever, his expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice flat, more out of obligation than genuine concern. Lea hesitated for a moment before responding. "Everything is as expected, I guess." He gave a brief nod, as if that was all he needed to hear. Yet, before turning away, he lingered for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. If you need anything, ask Sienna. I want you to be well." His words, simple as they were, caught her off guard. Was this a fleeting moment of sincerity, or just another way to ensure that the deal remained intact? Either way, that brief exchange stayed with her long after he walked away. Even with every comfort provided to her, Lea couldn't shake the unease that had begun creeping into her thoughts. On one cold, silent night, she stepped out onto the balcony of her room, wrapping her arms around herself as she gazed out at the vast garden below. The moonlight bathed the perfectly manicured hedges in silver, casting an eerie sort of beauty over the estate. Everything was so quiet, so different from the life she had once known. "Am I doing the right thing?" the question echoed in her mind. She had agreed to this arrangement knowing exactly what it entailed, but the idea of carrying a child, feeling it grow inside her only to walk away as if it had never been hers, that was something she hadn't truly allowed herself to process. The contract was explicit. She had no rights, no claim. But how could she so easily sever something so profoundly human? Meanwhile, from the other side of the house, Harrison watched from a distance. He wasn't a man who wasted time analyzing emotions. His world had always been one of logic, control, and precision. But despite his cold demeanor, he couldn't ignore the lingering curiosity growing inside him. Woe was this woman who had accepted such an unorthodox proposal? And why, for the first time in a long time, did he feel as though something about this deal wasn't as straightforward as he had believed? One evening, Lea sat in the dimly lit living room, idly browsing through a book she had pulled from the shelf. She wasn't particularly drawn to classic literature, but there was something oddly comforting about the quiet of the house. The soft rustle of pages, the faint scent of aged paper. She barely noticed when Harrison entered the room, a folder of documents in his hand. He seemed distracted, caught up in his thoughts, until his gaze landed on her. "I didn't expect to find you here," he said, stopping a few feet away. Lea looked up, arching an eyebrow. "I didn't expect you to talk to me," she replied, a wry smile tugging at the corner of her lips. For a split second, something unreadable flickered across Harrison's expression. Maybe, just maybe, this arrangement was about to become more complicated than either of them had anticipated. Harrison frowned but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he placed the folder on the table and sank into a nearby armchair, crossing his arms in a calculated manner. "Are you settling in?" he asked, his tone measured. Lea hesitated before answering. "I think so, but it still feels strange. It doesn't feel real." Harrison leaned forward slightly, his sharp gaze unwavering. "It doesn't have to feel real. This is a contract, Lea, an agreement. Everything will be carried out exactly as planned." She let out a quiet scoff, tilting her head as she studied him. "That's what you do, isn't it? Plan everything, calculate everything, leave no room for mistakes?" His expression didn't shift, but there was a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "That's how I've built everything I have," he said after a pause. "Planning prevents failure." Lea gave a short, humorless laugh, shaking her head. You can plan all you want, but not everything can be controlled, Harrison. Sometimes, failure is inevitable. And sometimes, she hesitated, meeting his gaze, you can't control how you feel. Her words hit him like a sharp, unexpected jab. His posture stiffened ever so slightly before he leaned back in the chair, choosing silence over argument. Lea noticed his reaction but decided not to push further. Instead, she turned away, picking up the book she had been reading. Without another word, she walked toward her room, leaving Harrison alone, his thoughts more unsettled than he would have liked. The days passed, and Lea found herself gradually adjusting to life in Harrison Lewis's mansion. Despite the undeniable luxury, she never quite felt like she belonged. Every perfectly placed piece of furniture, every extravagant decorative item seemed like a silent reminder that this world wasn't hers. She was simply a temporary fixture within it. Still, she followed the routine: frequent medical appointments, chef-prepared meals, a life structured by precision and planning. And yet, despite the comfort, an emotional emptiness lingered. At night, alone in her vast bedroom, she thought about the life she had left behind. It wasn't much, but at least it had been hers. Now, nothing felt in her control. The thought of carrying a child only to hand it over haunted her. No matter how hard she tried to push it away, it returned, especially in the stillness of the night, when there was nothing left to distract her. While Lea wrestled with her thoughts, Harrison watched her from a distance. He maintained his usual reserved demeanor, keeping their interactions minimal. But despite himself, he found that she occupied his thoughts more often than he expected. It wasn't romance, not yet, not exactly. But there was a curiosity he couldn't quite shake. She wasn't like the women he had encountered before. She wasn't driven by wealth, nor was she impressed by the life he had built. If anything, she seemed detached from it, and that intrigued him. One afternoon, after a long day of meetings, Harrison arrived home earlier than usual. Stepping out onto the terrace, he noticed Lea sitting alone in the garden, her face tilted toward the sky. She looked different in that moment. Not the guarded, defiant woman he had met that night on the streets, but someone softer, almost vulnerable. The sight of her there, lost in her own world, made something stir within him. Something unfamiliar, something unplanned. And for the first time in years, Harrison Lewis found himself standing still, watching, rather than calculating his next move. For a brief moment, Harrison hesitated. He wasn't sure why, but eventually he took a step forward and closed the distance between them. "Enjoying the garden?" he asked, his tone firm and direct, as always. Lea turned slightly, caught off guard by his presence, but she recovered quickly. "It's nice. Definitely better than the streets." There was something about her blunt honesty that made him pause. He wasn't used to it. People usually spoke to him with careful words, calculated responses. He lowered himself onto the bench beside her, maintaining a respectable distance. "Are you settling in?" he asked after a moment. Lea shrugged, her gaze drifting over the flowers in front of them. "It still feels strange, like I'm living someone else's life." Harrison studied her for a second before replying, "It's all part of the agreement. I want you to have everything you need so things go as planned." "As planned," she repeated, a flicker of irony in her voice. She turned to look at him, curiosity dancing in her blue eyes. "Do you always live like this, planning every second of your life?" Harrison frowned slightly. He wasn't used to being questioned, at least not in this way. People agreed with him. They followed his lead. They never challenged his way of thinking. "Planning is what keeps everything running," he said finally, his tone firm, decisive. "Without it, everything falls apart." Lea let out a faint smile, shaking her head. "I don't think everything can be controlled. Sometimes things just happen, whether you want them to or not." Her words unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Without another word, he stood up abruptly, brushing off the conversation. "If you need anything, let Sienna know," he said, before heading back inside. Lea watched him go, her expression unreadable. A few days later, Harrison made an unexpected decision. He would accompany Lea to one of her medical appointments. He justified it, of course, told himself it was simply to ensure that everything was progressing as planned, that it was just another step in maintaining control over the situation. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Lea, however, showed no surprise. She merely glanced at him with mild curiosity before nodding in acknowledgement. At the doctor's office, the usual examinations were conducted. Routine, procedural, predictable. Until suddenly it wasn't. The rhythmic sound of a heartbeat filled the room. Lea's breath hitched. She hadn't expected it to affect her the way it did. A lump formed in her throat, her chest tightening with an unfamiliar emotion. She blinked quickly, trying to hide the sheen of tears that welled in her eyes. Harrison, on the other hand, remained still. His expression was unreadable, his posture rigid, but something had shifted. His gaze, once detached, now held a flicker of something else. As if that simple sound, the steady, undeniable rhythm of life, had touched something buried deep inside him, something he wasn't prepared to face. "Everything looks perfect," the doctor said with a warm smile. "Everything is progressing well. You can start thinking about your next steps. Prenatal care, lifestyle adjustments, whatever you need." Lea nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. Harrison, however, remained completely silent. The drive back to the mansion was thick with unspoken words. The rhythmic sound of the road beneath them filled the space where conversation should have been. Harrison sat deep in thought, his usual air of control seemingly shaken. Lea glanced at him once, debating whether to say something, but she chose to let the silence linger. When they finally arrived at the mansion, Harrison did something unexpected. He stepped out first and opened the car door for her. It was a simple gesture, but it caught her off guard. She hesitated for a second before stepping out. "Thank you for today," she said quietly, searching his face for some trace of the thoughts he had kept to himself the entire ride. "It was the least I could do," he replied, his voice measured. He didn't look at her directly, as if avoiding something. "I'll make sure everything continues to go well." And with that, he turned and walked inside, his posture always impeccable, his movements controlled. Yet something about him felt different. Lea watched him disappear into the house, a quiet curiosity stirring inside her. If the sound of the baby's heartbeat reached a part of him he had long ignored, or was she imagining things? In the days that followed, subtle changes began to take shape. Harrison started appearing in the common areas of the house more frequently. Their interactions, once stiff and transactional, became something else. Their conversations, though brief, felt less mechanical, less forced. He asked about her appointments, about how she was feeling. Once, he even suggested activities to help her relax. It wasn't much, but it was something. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the long dining table, eating in silence as usual, Harrison unexpectedly broke the pattern. "Have you thought about what you want to do after all this is over?" Lea looked up, caught off guard by the question. It was the first time he had expressed any interest in her future. "I don't have any plans," she admitted. "I still don't know what my life will be like after this." Harrison nodded, seeming to turn her answer over in his mind. "You'll have the resources to start over wherever you want," he said after a pause. "Just make sure you do." He looked at her then, his gaze steady. "Something worthwhile." Lea studied him, trying to decipher the meaning behind his words. Behind the cool detachment, was there something else? A trace of concern? She didn't know, but for the first time, she didn't feel entirely alone in the mansion. One morning, as Lea stepped out of her room, she noticed something unusual. A package. It was left at her door, wrapped in pristine, elegant paper, as if it had been prepared with great care. A small handwritten note rested on top. "To help with your free time." Curious, she carefully unwrapped it, her fingers brushing over the crisp folds of the paper. Inside was a brand new sketchbook and a set of high-quality pencils. Lea inhaled sharply. She hadn't told anyone about her love for drawing, and yet, somehow, he knew. For the first time since she had stepped into this world of structured contracts and calculated decisions, she felt seen. During one of their early conversations, Lea had casually mentioned how she used to draw, how it had once been her escape, a way to distract herself from everything else. But she had never expected him to remember, let alone care. That night, as she sat in the garden, lost in thought with the sketchbook in her lap, Harrison happened to pass by. He slowed, hesitating for only a moment before speaking. "Did you like the gift?" he asked, his tone casual, almost as if he wasn't sure why he was asking. Lea looked up, surprised he had even brought it up. "Yes," she said, fingers tightening slightly around the sketchbook. "Thank you, I didn't expect this." Harrison shrugged, his expression unreadable. "It seemed like something that could be good for you." A small, genuine smile tugged at her lips as she held the sketchbook closer. "It was," she admitted simply. There was no further discussion, no unnecessary words. Yet, as Harrison walked away, Lea couldn't help but feel that this small exchange meant something more than either of them was willing to acknowledge. Despite the carefully structured comfort of the mansion, Lea couldn't shake the sense of emptiness that lingered with each passing day. She was physically here, but in so many ways she felt disconnected from it all. Even as her body adjusted to the new routine, her mind remained restless. And though Harrison still carried himself with his usual controlled, unwavering demeanor, Lea had begun to sense something beneath the surface, something he carefully kept locked away. Then, one morning, something unexpected happened. After breakfast, Harrison made a request. "I'd like to speak with you," he said, his tone as steady as ever, but there was something in his voice, something slightly different. It wasn't a demand, it was a request. Lea frowned slightly but nodded. A short while later, she found him waiting in the sitting room, a neat stack of papers beside him. Her stomach tightened. "I want to discuss some additional details of the contract," he said, his voice cool, direct. Lea felt a pang of unease. Was he about to change the terms? Impose new conditions? "More details?" she asked, her tone careful. "I thought everything was already settled." Harrison studied her for a moment, then shook his head. "It's nothing that alters the agreement. I just want to ensure you understand what happens after the birth. I want to avoid any surprises." Lea exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. "I think I get it," she said. "I leave, and you go on with your life." He gave a small nod. "Yes, but I want you to know that if you need anything afterward, regardless of the agreement, I'll be available to help. I don't want you to feel abandoned." Lea blinked, caught off guard. She had expected precision, detachment. But this sounded personal. "That's unexpected coming from you," she said, unable to keep the hint of sarcasm from her voice. Harrison simply shrugged. "I want complications, and this is the best way to avoid them." Lea let out a quiet chuckle, but as she studied his expression, something about his seriousness made her rethink her sarcasm. Maybe, just maybe, he really was trying, even if he didn't quite know how. Later that day, needing to clear her mind, Lea decided to explore the mansion further. There was still so much she hadn't seen, so many rooms that held no meaning to her. But maybe, just maybe, if she wandered long enough, she'd find something here that didn't make her feel like she was merely passing through. Something that, even for a fleeting moment, made this place feel real. The mansion was vast, almost labyrinthine. Hallways stretched endlessly, each leading to rooms adorned with artwork that likely cost more than she could fathom. As Lea wandered, she let her fingers brush against the intricate wood paneling, feeling the cool smoothness beneath her fingertips. Everything here was designed to impress, to exude power, and yet despite its grandeur, the house felt empty. At the end of one hallway, she came across a slightly open door. Curiosity got the better of her, and she peeked inside. It was a small study, dimly lit, the scent of aged books and polished wood lingering in the air. Harrison was inside. But for the first time, he didn't look like the composed, calculating man she had come to know. He wasn't working, wasn't buried in contracts or business reports. Instead, he sat at his desk, holding a framed photograph in his hands. His gaze was fixed on it, lost in thought. Lea couldn't make out the image, but something about the way he held it, carefully, almost reverently, made her hesitate. He looked different, vulnerable. Before she could decide whether to turn away, she knocked softly on the door. Harrison flinched slightly, his movements sharp as he quickly set the photograph down, his mask of indifference snapping back into place. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," Lea said hesitantly, stepping just inside the doorway. His eyes met hers, unreadable, guarded. "It's nothing," he replied smoothly. "Did you need something?" "No," she admitted. "I was just exploring the house." She hesitated, sensing the weight of whatever had been on his mind. "You looked like you were thinking about something important." A flicker of something, hesitation, regret, crossed his face before he turned away. We all have things we'd rather keep to ourselves, he said, his voice measured. Lea studied him, realizing this was the first time she had seen even a crack in his usually impenetrable exterior. But sensing he didn't want to dwell on it, she shifted the conversation. This house is massive. Do you always live here alone? Harrison nodded, crossing his arms over his chest in that familiar defensive way. It's more practical than it seems. I don't like distractions, and here, I have the space I need. Lea tilted her head, observing him. That must be strange, she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Having all this, but no one to share it with. Something in his expression tightened, but he looked away before she could decipher it. I'm used to it, he said flatly. I don't need anyone to do what I do. Lea wanted to believe him, but there was something in his tone, something hollow, that suggested otherwise. Before she could push further, he stood abruptly, signaling the conversation was over. If you need anything, Sienna can help, he said, his voice returning to its usual detached professionalism. Lea nodded but didn't move right away. She watched as he walked past her, his posture rigid, his steps precise. The study door closed behind him with a quiet but definitive click. That night, unable to shake the encounter from her mind, Lea stepped onto the terrace. The sky stretched above her, vast and open, the stars faint against the city lights in the distance. She wrapped her arms around herself, inhaling the cool night air. Harrison had everything, wealth, power, control, but beneath it all there was something else, something missing. And for reasons she couldn't quite explain, she found herself wondering what or who had been in that photograph. Sitting there, Lea let her mind drift. The night was calm, the air crisp against her skin, but her thoughts were anything but still. She thought about the baby's heartbeat, the rhythmic, steady sound she had heard during the last checkup, a sound that had stirred something inside her, something she couldn't quite explain. She had told herself this was just a transaction, that she was merely a vessel fulfilling a contract. But no matter how hard she tried to keep her emotions at bay, the lines were beginning to blur. Her fingers unconsciously traced the fabric of her dress as she exhaled slowly. Then she heard footsteps. Turning, she saw Harrison approaching. His expression was unreadable, but there was a weariness in his eyes. Despite that, he still carried himself with that same unwavering posture, like a man who refused to let exhaustion touch him. You like this spot, don't you? He asked as he came to stand beside her. It helps me think. He glanced at the horizon, where the city lights flickered like distant stars. A pause stretched between them before he finally spoke. Thinking isn't always a good thing. Lea let out a quiet, humorless laugh. Try telling that to someone who spends most of their time alone. Harrison didn't respond right away. His jaw tightened slightly, as if he was weighing his words, and then, unexpectedly, his voice softened. Sometimes, being surrounded by people doesn't help much either. Lea turned her head to look at him, catching something in his tone she hadn't heard before. Something almost hollow. Outthinking, she spoke. Maybe you need something you can't control, Harrison. The words hung in the air between them. She didn't regret saying them. For a moment, his gaze flickered with something. Conflict, maybe even recognition? But just as quickly, it was gone. He frowned, as if considering a response, then seemed to think better of it. And without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the house. Lea remained on the terrace, alone once more. But this time, her thoughts weren't just about herself. In the weeks that followed, she realized something unsettling. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't keep an emotional barrier between herself and Harrison. He remained enigmatic, guarded, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where cracks seemed to form in his carefully constructed walls. Moments where something real slipped through. And though she knew she should keep her distance, a part of her wanted to understand the man who had brought her into this world. At the same time, Harrison found himself battling emotions he couldn't quite name. This arrangement was supposed to be simple, structured, controlled. But Lea wasn't just a part of the plan anymore, and that terrified him. The following week, it was time for another checkup. Lea woke early, a strange mix of anxiety and anticipation sitting heavy in her chest. The months were passing faster than she had expected, and the thought of seeing the baby, really seeing it, even if just on a screen, made her heart race. She placed a hand over her stomach, exhaling slowly. She had convinced herself this wasn't supposed to feel personal. But it did. And there was no denying it anymore. Lea wondered if Harrison would be there for this appointment, just as he had been the last time. She wasn't sure why it mattered, but it did. When she came downstairs for breakfast, she found Sienna going over the day's schedule with him. "Ready?" Harrison asked, barely looking up from the folder of documents spread before him. "Ready enough," Lea replied, trying to sound steadier than she felt. "Good. We'll go together." His words were simple, factual, leaving no space for debate. Lea nodded, suppressing the mix of nerves and anticipation curling in her stomach as they headed to the car. The silence between them felt heavier than usual. Harrison as always seemed composed, his focus fixed somewhere ahead. But there was something different about him today, something she couldn't quite place. He was just as unsettled as she was, though of course he'd never admit it. At the doctor's office, they were greeted with a warm smile. "Good to see you again," the physician said, motioning for Lea to lie down as he prepped the ultrasound equipment. "Today we should get a much clearer view of the baby." Lea adjusted herself on the exam table, her heart pounding. She barely registered the cool gel being applied to her abdomen. The moment the transducer pressed against her skin, she held her breath. Harrison, standing beside her, crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on the monitor. And then, a sound. The rhythmic, steady thump-thump filled the room. But it wasn't just one heartbeat, it was two. The doctor's expression shifted into a small, knowing smile. "Well," he said, pointing at the screen, "here's the surprise we couldn't see last time. You're expecting twins." Lea, "Twins?" Shock rippled through her, followed closely by something unexpected. Something warm? A hand instinctively moved to her belly, as if trying to grasp the reality of it. She had never considered this possibility, and yet, now that she knew, a strange sense of joy flickered through her. She wasn't sure what it meant. She only knew that it meant more. Beside her, Harrison remained silent for several seconds. His usual composed expression wavered, giving way to something Lea had never seen before. Lea leaned slightly forward, eyes locked on the screen. "Two?" he asked, as if needing the confirmation spoken aloud. "Two," the doctor confirmed with a reassuring nod. "Both are growing well and appear healthy." Silence followed, filled only with the soft hum of the machine and the unmistakable, powerful rhythm of two tiny heartbeats. For Lea, it was magic. No matter how hard she had tried to keep an emotional distance, the sound, the image, the sheer reality of it all broke through her defenses. She wasn't just carrying a child, she was carrying them. And no matter what the contract said, in that moment, she felt them. Her children. She wasn't sure what that meant yet, but she knew one thing. There was no going back. Harrison, standing beside her, seemed equally moved. He didn't say much. He rarely did, but his eyes told a different story. For the first time, the impenetrable walls he had so carefully built around himself seemed to crack. He looked at the screen not as a businessman overseeing a contract, but as a man confronted with the undeniable reality of life. Two lives. On the drive back to the mansion, the silence between them was unlike any before. It wasn't cold. It wasn't distant. It was heavy with meaning. Lea was the first to break it. "You don't seem like the kind of person who gets easily surprised," she remarked, glancing sideways at him, trying to lighten the tension. Harrison exhaled slowly, his grip firm on the steering wheel, his gaze locked on the road. "I'm not," he admitted. He paused, as if carefully choosing his next words. "But this is different." Lea studied him, intrigued. Harrison rarely let his emotions slip through the cracks, yet right now he seemed lost in thought, unsettled in a way she had never seen before. "Is it scary?" she asked softly. He turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to the road. "No," he said after a moment. "It's impressive. Knowing that in a few months, two completely new beings will be here, depending on me." Something twisted in Lea's chest. She had spent so much time trying to convince herself that this was just a deal, a contract to secure her future. But hearing him say those words, hearing the weight of responsibility in his voice, made her realize just how deeply connected she already was to these babies. They also depend on me, at least for now, she murmured, trying to keep her voice steady. Harrison nodded, his expression unreadable. "I know," he said. Then, with a sincerity that took her off guard, he added, "And that's why I want to make sure you're okay, Lea. Not just physically, but in every way. That matters to me." Lea looked at him, truly looked at him, searching for any trace of calculation or obligation in his words. But there was none. For the first time, he was speaking not as a man managing a contract, but as someone who genuinely cared. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply stayed quiet, absorbing his words. That night, Lea found herself back on the terrace, staring out at the distant horizon. The sky was vast, open, endless. It made her feel small, yet somehow comforted at the same time. Then she heard footsteps behind her. Harrison. He hesitated before stepping closer, something uncharacteristically uncertain in his stance. He wasn't a man who second-guessed himself, yet tonight he seemed different. "I can't stop thinking about what the doctor said today," he admitted, lowering himself onto the seat beside her. 2 babies, 2 futures. Lea turned her head, surprised at his openness. "It's a lot of responsibility, isn't it?" she asked gently. "It's more than that," Harrison murmured, his gaze fixed on the city lights. "It's the first time I feel like something in my life can't be calculated. I can't plan who these 2 will become. I can't control who they'll grow into." His words hung between them, heavy and unguarded. Lea had never imagined hearing him say something like that. Because for the first time, Harrison Lewis, the man who had built his entire life around precision, logic, and control, was admitting that there was something bigger than him. Something unpredictable. Something real. And just like that, the lines between contract and reality blurred a little more. Lea felt a chill at his words. It was rare, almost unheard of, for Harrison to admit that something was beyond his control. And yet, here he was, acknowledging the very thing that defined him, the inability to predict and control everything. She realized then that, like her, he was changing, perhaps reluctantly, perhaps without even realizing it. "Sometimes that can be a good thing," she murmured. "Not knowing what's next, it can bring things you never imagined." Harrison looked at her, his sharp gaze softer than usual, as though he was actually considering her words. For the first time, it seemed he wasn't just dismissing the idea, he was letting it settle, and that, in itself, was something. In the days that followed, the mansion, once a place of quiet precision and routine, began to shift. The news about the twins had breathed something new into its grand halls. Sienna took the lead in making adjustments to the nursery that had already been prepared, now modifying it for 2. The staff, who had always moved with quiet efficiency, now bustled with more energy as preparations for the babies took center stage. Lea watched the transformation unfold with mixed emotions. She knew logically, that these children were not hers to keep. But deep down she also knew that reality was going to be far more painful than she had ever anticipated. As the preparations continued, an undeniable truth settled between her and Harrison. What had started as a straightforward agreement had become something much more complicated. The twins, 2 lives not even born yet, were already reshaping them in ways neither had foreseen. The days following the revelation of the twins brought a subtle yet undeniable shift between Lea and Harrison. Though he remained the same methodical and reserved man, small gestures began to emerge, things she never would have expected from him. One afternoon, after a routine medical appointment, Harrison did something out of character. Instead of leaving her in Sienna's care or letting a driver escort her, he insisted on walking her to the car himself. As he held the door open, he looked at her with something that almost resembled concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone even but softer, somehow. Lea blinked, surprised by the gesture. "Yes, I'm fine, thank you." On the drive back to the mansion, the usual silence between them was unexpectedly broken. "Is there anything you need?" Harrison asked suddenly. Anything that might make you more comfortable." Lea turned to look at him, trying to read his expression. It wasn't just idle politeness. There was something in the way he asked, something genuine, something that didn't quite fit the man who had once treated this arrangement as nothing more than a business deal. "Nothing comes to mind right now, but thank you for asking," she replied cautiously. He nodded and returned his focus to the road, but Lea felt it. Something was shifting, and despite all her reservations, she couldn't ignore it. Back at the mansion, more signs of change began to appear. One evening, as she entered her room, she noticed something different. A set of new pillows and blankets had been neatly placed on the bed, the fabric plush and inviting. Resting on top was a small, simple note. "To help you rest better." Lea stared at it, her fingers brushing over the paper. A warmth spread through her chest. It was such a small act, quiet, almost unspoken, but it carried meaning. And that perhaps was the most unexpected thing of all. Later, as Lea sat in the living room, sipping her tea, she heard footsteps approaching. Harrison entered, moving with his usual quiet confidence. He settled into the armchair across from her, his posture as composed as ever. Yet there was something different about him tonight. Something more at ease, even if only slightly. "Did you like what I left in your room?" he asked bluntly. Lea glanced at him, studying his expression. "Yes, I did," she admitted. "It was thoughtful of you." "Good," he nodded, his gaze steady. "I want to make sure you're comfortable. That's important to me." There was something disarming about his directness. Lea frowned slightly, not out of discomfort, but because she wasn't sure what to make of it. "You're changing, Harrison," she said, watching him closely. "Or at least it seems that way. But I still don't know why." Harrison held her gaze for a long moment, as if weighing whether to answer at all. Finally, he exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. "Maybe you're right," he admitted. "Maybe I am changing. But the truth is, I don't know how to be different. I'm not used to caring." The words hung in the air between them, raw and unguarded. Lea's fingers tightened slightly around her teacup. It wasn't just what he had said, it was the fact that he had said it. Harrison Lewis did not reveal vulnerabilities, and yet, here he was, exposing something that even he seemed unsettled by. For the first time, she saw him, not the businessman, not the calculating strategist, but the man beneath it all. That night, Lea found herself once again on the terrace, staring at the sky. She let the night breeze wrap around her, but it did little to quiet her thoughts. Harrison wasn't what she had expected. He was still difficult to figure out, still distant in so many ways, but there was something beneath the rigid exterior, something real. She just didn't know yet if that was a good thing or a dangerous one. Meanwhile, in his office, Harrison sat at his desk, staring at the contract in front of him. The document that had once been everything, a clear, controlled plan, now felt different in his hands. He had entered this arrangement with a single goal, to have an heir and move on with his life. It had all been so simple. But now things weren't simple at all, because he cared, and that terrified him. The next morning, Harrison did something unexpected. He joined Lea for breakfast. She looked up as he sat down across from her, surprised by the break in his usual routine. "There's something I'd like to discuss," he said, his tone direct. Lea set down her fork, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What is it?" He hesitated, a rare moment of indecision, before answering. "I know you still don't trust me," he admitted. "And I don't blame you for that. I've never been good at trusting people, and it's turned me into someone who maybe isn't easy to deal with." Lea didn't interrupt. She simply listened. Harrison exhaled slowly, his fingers resting on the edge of the table. "I've had experiences that taught me not to depend on anyone, to keep people at a distance, to never let anyone close enough to hurt me." His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Something real. "But with you, with what we're building," he looked at her then, something unspoken in his expression. "I realize that maybe I'm wrong." Lea blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Harrison Lewis was a man of control, of calculated decisions and logic. He didn't do emotions, he didn't do uncertainty. And yet, here he was, admitting that something about this, about them, was shifting. She just wasn't sure what it meant yet. For either of them. "We all have our barriers, Harrison," Lea said softly, "but that doesn't mean we need to hide behind them forever." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe you're right," he admitted. "But changing isn't easy for me." Lea offered a small, knowing smile. No one said it would be. Later that day, much to her surprise, Harrison joined her for a walk in the garden. At first, their conversation was light, surface level, safe. But inevitably, it drifted back to the one thing that now connected them more than anything else. "Have you thought about names?" Harrison asked suddenly. Lea turned to him, caught off guard. "No, not yet," she admitted. "I thought that was something you'd want to decide on your own." Harrison shook his head. "I think it would be fair to do it together." Lea blinked, momentarily unsure how to respond. Harrison Lewis was a man who operated on control and precision. The fact that he wanted her input on something this personal was unexpected. To her amazement, she realized he was trying. And while she still remained cautious, she couldn't deny that his efforts were real. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, they found themselves sitting on a bench, the warm hues of dusk stretching across the horizon. "I never imagined I'd be here, doing something like this," Lea murmured, more to herself than to him. "Neither did I," Harrison admitted, his lips curving into the faintest of smiles. "But maybe this is exactly where we need to be." Lea turned to look at him, noticing something in his expression. Something she hadn't seen before. For the first time, Harrison seemed to be letting go, even if just a little. And maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just a contract anymore. Maybe it was the beginning of something far greater than either of them had anticipated. The morning started like any other day. Lea felt the weight of her growing pregnancy in every movement, but she pushed through, determined to keep up with her routine. Harrison, as usual, was in his office, buried in documents. Their interactions had become a quiet comfort, a steady rhythm that neither of them acknowledged aloud, yet both had come to rely on. But something was different today. Just before lunch, a sudden pain gripped Lea's body. At first, she tried to brush it off. Pregnancy came with its fair share of discomfort, and she had learned to endure it. But then the pain deepened. It wasn't just another ache. Her breath caught, and instinctively her hand went to her stomach. Alarmed, she called out for Sienna, who arrived almost instantly, her eyes widening as she took in Lea's strained expression. "This isn't normal," Lea whispered, her voice tight. Sienna didn't hesitate. "Harrison needs to know about this," she said firmly, already reaching for her phone. "This could be the start of labor." Lea barely heard her. Another wave of pain crashed over her, stronger this time. Her heart pounded. It's too soon. The realization sent a ripple of fear through her. Across the mansion, buried in his work, Harrison had no idea how much his world was about to change. Lea nodded, her breathing uneven as another wave of pain crashed over her. She gritted her teeth, trying to stay calm, but the intensity was undeniable. This wasn't just another discomfort. This was it. Sienna moved swiftly, disappearing down the hall to find Harrison. In minutes, he appeared in the doorway. For the first time since she had met him, his normally unreadable face was stripped of its usual control. She saw it. Genuine concern. "Lea, what's happening?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically sharp as he strode toward her. "I think it's happening," she gasped. "The babies are coming." For a brief second, Harrison seemed frozen, caught between shock and reality. But then, as quickly as the hesitation appeared, it was gone. His instincts took over. Without another word, he grabbed his phone, his voice commanding and urgent as he ordered the driver to get the car ready. "Sienna, pack whatever we need for the hospital, now." Turning back to Lea, he placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "We're going now." His voice was firm, decisive. But underneath it, there was something else. Something Lea had never heard before. Emotion. The ride to the hospital passed in a blur. Lea clenched her fists, focusing on controlling her breathing as the contractions intensified. Beside her, Harrison sat rigid, his usual calm shaken. He wasn't used to feeling helpless, and she could tell it unnerved him. Then, without thinking, he reached for her hand. The gesture was instinctive, automatic, but it was also real. "We're almost there," he said, his grip tightening just slightly. "You'll be okay. We'll be okay." Lea didn't have the energy to respond, but something about his words, about the way he said them, sent a strange sense of calm through her. She wasn't alone in this. None anymore. One, handsome, a good boy. One, who had made her laugh. 3. At the hospital, everything moved quickly. A medical team, already prepped thanks to Harrison's meticulous planning, rushed forward as soon as they arrived. Lea barely had time to process before she was being wheeled into the delivery room. Harrison moved to follow, only for a nurse to stop him at the door. "You'll have to wait outside, sir." "I'm staying," he cut in, his voice sharp, unwavering. The nurse hesitated, but something in his expression made it clear that this wasn't a request. And so he stayed. He stayed right beside Lea, his hand gripping hers, his presence steady as she fought through the pain. "I'm not going anywhere," he murmured, his thumb grazing the back of her hand. Lea barely heard him through the haze of exhaustion, but she felt the weight of his words. He meant it. The next hours were a storm of intensity, pain, and emotions Lea couldn't quite name. And through it all, Harrison was there. For someone who had spent his entire life controlling everything, this was the first time he had ever felt powerless. And yet, he felt everything. New. Alive. A cry filled the room. The weight of it hit Harrison like a physical force, knocking the breath from his chest. "A boy," the doctor announced, smiling as he held up the small, wriggling infant, a beautiful, healthy boy. Harrison's heart pounded as he stared at the newborn being carefully placed on a nearby table. His son. His mind barely had time to register the reality before another cry. Softer, but no less powerful. His head snapped toward the doctor, his body stiff as he processed what he was hearing. "A girl," the doctor confirmed. His daughter. Harrison swallowed hard, his throat tight as he stared at the two tiny figures now existing in the world. His world. For the first time in his life, something beyond his control had changed everything. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. Lea, exhausted but with eyes shining, watched as the nurses gently cleaned and wrapped the two tiny lives she had brought into the world. She longed to hold them, to feel their warmth against her chest, but she knew this moment would be fleeting. She had prepared herself for this, for the distance, for the inevitability of letting go. But nothing could have prepared her for the way her heart clenched at the sight of them. Beside her, Harrison stood frozen, his usually sharp mind momentarily stunned into silence. He watched as the doctors worked, his gaze fixed on the two fragile beings that now carried his name, his blood, his everything. Then, as if something inside him finally gave way, he stepped forward. He reached for Lea's hand, his grip warm and steady. "You were incredible," he said, his voice rough with something she had never heard before. "Thank you." Silent tears spilled down Lea's cheeks, though she couldn't quite tell if they were from joy, relief, or the slow ache of a heart already beginning to fracture. And then, finally, the babies were placed in her arms. Lea held them carefully, cradling their impossibly small bodies, feeling the rhythmic rise and fall of their chests against her own. She studied them, memorizing every tiny detail. Their delicate eyelashes, the way their tiny fingers curled instinctively, the soft warmth of their skin. It was overwhelming. And she knew, in that moment, that no matter what happened next, no matter what the contract said, she would never be able to leave them behind without carrying a piece of them forever. Harrison remained by her side, quiet but visibly shaken in a way she had never seen before. When the doctor finally handed the boy to him, he hesitated for the briefest second before reaching out, his usually firm hands suddenly careful, almost hesitant. And then, something shifted. The moment the child settled in his arms, Harrison Lewis, the man who had built his life on control, on logic, on calculated decisions, softened. The hardened edges of his expression melted into something almost tender. This was not just about an heir. This was life in its purest form. A bond he had never allowed himself to experience. Then, when he was handed his daughter, something even deeper broke inside him. He closed his eyes for a moment, his jaw tightening as if trying to commit this moment, this feeling, to memory. When he finally looked at Lea, there was something unexpected in his expression. Something unguarded, something real. "They're perfect," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. Lea nodded, still cradling the boy, her tears falling freely now. She didn't try to stop them. She didn't want to stop them. That night, while Lea rested in her hospital bed, Harrison found himself unable to leave the observation area. He stood by the glass, watching the twins sleep. His mind, so accustomed to strategy, to logic, to planning every outcome, had never prepared him for this, for the flood of emotions he couldn't control, for the quiet realization that these children were not just part of a plan. They were not just his legacy. They were something much, much greater. They were his connection to something he had never allowed himself to feel. True love, the weight of it was terrifying, and yet, for the first time in his life, he didn't want to run from it. A quiet rustling broke him from his thoughts. Sienna had arrived, carrying a cup of coffee beside him, and studied his face before asking, her voice soft, "Mr. Lewis, is everything all right?" Harrison turned to her, his usual mask of composure slipping. For a moment he seemed to struggle for words. Then finally, "I don't know," he admitted, and for Harrison Lewis that was the most honest thing he had ever said. "For the first time in a long while, I think it is," Harrison murmured. Sienna studied him for a moment before offering a small, knowing smile. Then, without another word, she turned and left, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Alone with his children. Meanwhile, in her hospital room, Lea stirred awake, an unsettling weight settling in her chest. The room was quiet, too quiet. She had expected to feel joy, but instead there was an ache, a heavy, undeniable loneliness pressing down on her. She had carried these babies, felt their every movement, given them life, and yet she knew the truth that loomed over everything. They wouldn't be hers for much longer. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing the tears away, trying to convince herself that she had always known this would happen. Then the door creaked open. She looked up and saw Harrison standing there, both babies cradled in his arms. Something inside her shifted. He looked different, not just tired, not just overwhelmed, changed. As if this moment had altered not just his connection to the babies, but also to her. Wordlessly, he walked toward the bed and carefully handed her the boy before sitting beside her, still holding the girl. For a while they simply sat there, each lost in their own thoughts, the quiet filled only by the soft sounds of the twins breathing. Then, finally, Harrison spoke. "I don't know how," he admitted, his voice lower than usual, almost unsure, "but this has changed everything." Lea nodded, unable to find the right words. Because she knew, no matter how difficult what came next would be, no matter what the contract said, this moment was real. A miracle she would never forget. Months later, the mansion was steeped in heavy silence. Lea knew what today meant. The weeks following the twins' birth had been a whirlwind of emotions. A fragile balance between overwhelming joy and quiet anguish. She had loved them more deeply than she ever thought possible. But the contract was clear. Her time here was ending. Today was the day she was supposed to walk away. As she packed her few belongings into a small suitcase, her eyes drifted to the cribs where the babies still slept peacefully. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the last of her clothes. She had told herself she wouldn't cry. She didn't want her final memories to be marked by weakness. She had agreed to this. She had known this moment would come, but knowing it didn't make it hurt any less. A soft knock at the door made her inhale sharply. Sienna entered, her expression careful, as if she already knew what Lea was feeling. "Is everything ready?" she asked gently. Lea swallowed against the lump in her throat and nodded. "Yes," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Thank you for everything, Sienna." The assistant hesitated, shifting slightly before finally speaking. "Are you sure this is what you want?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "Because it seems like there's something more between you and Mr. Lewis." Leah's heart clenched. For a split second, she let herself imagine something different. A world where she wasn't just walking away. A world where they had a different kind of ending. But then, reality pressed down on her like a weight. She forced a smile even though her heart felt like it was breaking. It's not about what I want, she whispered. It's about what was agreed upon. Sienna didn't press further. She simply gave a small nod before stepping away, promising to let Harrison know that Lea was ready to leave. As Lea descended the grand staircase, her suitcase in hand, she found him waiting in the foyer. Harrison stood by the front door, his posture rigid, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. But his eyes were locked onto her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. There was no trace of the cold, calculating man she had met months ago. The Harrison standing before her now looked different, vulnerable, as if he were about to lose something that mattered more than he could put into words. "Everything's ready," he said. Lea said, breaking the silence. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step closer, his gaze searching hers. "Are you really leaving?" he asked, his voice low, almost hoarse. Lea's fingers tightened around the handle of her suitcase. She felt the lump in her throat, the familiar ache pressing against her ribs, but she forced herself to stay firm. "That was the deal," she said quietly. "I've done my part. Now it's time to move on." Harrison remained still for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a stack of papers. The contract, the agreement that had brought them together. He held it between his fingers, turning it slightly as if seeing it for the first time. "This contract," he murmured, his voice steady now, "should never have defined what's happening between us." Before she could respond, he tore the document in half, then again, and again. The sound of paper ripping filled the space between them, each shred falling to the floor like a declaration, like a choice. Lea froze, her heart pounding as she stared at the fragments of the life she had prepared herself for. "I don't want you to go, Lea," Harrison said, stepping closer. His voice was raw, stripped of all the careful detachment he had once worn like armor. "I don't want this to end here." Her breath hitched. This wasn't the man who had approached her with a business deal, the man who had insisted on control, on detachment. This was someone else, someone real. "Harrison," she whispered, her voice shaky, "you can't just tear up a contract and expect that to change everything. It's not that simple." "I know it's not simple," he admitted, his jaw tight. "Nothing about this has been simple for me, but these past few months have shown me something I never had the courage to admit. I need you, Lea." His eyes burned into hers, pleading in a way she never thought she would see from him. "Not just because of the twins," he continued, his voice thick with emotion, "but because you brought something into my life that I didn't even know was missing." His words hit her like a tidal wave, breaking through every wall she had tried to rebuild around her heart. But fear still clung to her ribs, wrapping around her like a vice. "And how do I know this is real?" she whispered, tears threatening to spill. "How can I trust that you won't change your mind? That you won't pull away when things get tough?" Harrison exhaled deeply, his face betraying the struggle inside him. "You don't," he admitted, his voice quiet but sure. Lea blinked, taken aback. "But I do know this," he continued, stepping even closer until she could feel the warmth of him, the weight of his presence anchoring her in place. "I know that the idea of you walking out that door terrifies me more than anything I've ever faced. I know that when I look at you, I see my future, not because of some contract, but because you are my choice." His voice dropped lower, more urgent. "You and the twins, you are the only thing that's ever made me question the way I've lived my life, and I don't want to go back to the way things were before you." Lea swallowed hard, her heart hammering. She had spent so long convincing herself that this was temporary, that leaving was the right thing to do, but standing here looking into his eyes, she realized maybe she didn't want to go either. Tears finally slipped down her cheeks, but this time she didn't wipe them away, because for the first time in so long, she wasn't crying out of sorrow. She was crying because she finally had a choice, and maybe, just maybe, she was ready to make it. "Because I've already tried living without feeling anything for anyone," Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "And it left me empty." His eyes locked onto hers, raw and unguarded in a way she had never seen before. "You showed me that I don't need to be afraid of connecting, of being human," he continued. "And yes, it scares me, but what scares me more is losing this, losing you." Lea felt the tears streaming down her face, but still there was something holding her back. A wall, built from years of disappointment and pain. "I fell in love with you, Harrison," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper, choked with emotion. He inhaled sharply, as if hearing those words shook him to his core. "But you don't understand how hard it is to trust someone again," she continued. "I've spent my whole life being discarded, ignored. How can I believe you won't do the same?" Harrison moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath against her skin. "Because you changed everything for me," he murmured. "And I'm not the kind of man who says that lightly. I don't know how to prove it to you, Lea, but I'm willing to try. Every day for the rest of my life. If you give me that chance." His words crashed into her defenses, shaking the walls she had spent years building. For so long she had braced herself for rejection, for abandonment. But this, his words, his eyes, his very presence, was different. "What if it doesn't work out?" she whispered, still holding on to the last thread of doubt. Harrison reached for her hands, his grip strong and unwavering. "Then we'll try again," he said simply. And again, if necessary. His eyes burned into hers, full of certainty. "I won't give up on you, Lea. Never." For a moment, time seemed to stop. Lea felt the weight of her doubts, her fears, the ghosts of her past, begin to fade. In their place, something new bloomed. Something she had been too afraid to name until now. Hope. She studied the man in front of her, realizing that he meant every word. That for the first time in his life, Harrison was choosing to let go of his control, his barriers. For her? Finally she nodded, her breath hitching as she let the tears fall freely. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll stay." Harrison let out a deep, shaky breath, one he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Then, without hesitation, he pulled her into a tight embrace, wrapping her in warmth, in certainty. Lea closed her eyes, letting herself sink into the feeling. For the first time in a long, long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The day was just breaking over the mansion. Soft golden light spilled through the windows, casting a warm glow over everything it touched. Lea woke to the faint sounds of the twins stirring in the nursery next door. She smiled. Morning was different. For the first time, she didn't wake up feeling the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her chest. For the first time, she wasn't living under the shadow of a contract. She had chosen to stay. And more importantly, Harrison had chosen to open his heart, allowing them to build something together. Lea got up and quietly made her way to the nursery. The soft morning light streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow over the two tiny figures stirring in their cribs. She leaned over, gently stroking their rosy cheeks, whispering soft words of love as they cooed in response. Their tiny hands reached instinctively toward her, and she felt her heart swell with emotions too vast to name. Behind her, she could get lost in the moment. She heard footsteps behind her. Harrison stood in the doorway, his arms crossed loosely over his chest, watching them with a quiet expression. But there was something different about the way he looked at them. At her. His eyes, once filled with control and detachment, now held something softer, something Lea could only describe as love. "Good morning," he said, stepping into the room. "Good morning," she replied, as he moved toward the crib. Harrison reached down, carefully lifting their baby boy into his arms. He held him close, his large hands impossibly gentle, as if he had been doing this his entire life. He stared at his son, an unreadable emotion flickering in his gaze. "I don't think I ever imagined this moment would feel so natural," he admitted, more to himself than to her. Lea watched him, her heart tightening in the best way. It was one thing to see Harrison Lewis as the powerful, unshakable man who once treated life like a business transaction, but this, seeing him so present, so open, so devoted, was something she had never expected. And yet it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The weeks that followed were a time of adjustment. Harrison, though clearly out of his depth, tried. He asked questions, sought advice, and despite his usual confidence in business, he had no shame in admitting he had no idea how to change a diaper. At first, he was awkward, struggling with tiny clothes, fumbling with bottles, but he never gave up. Lea watched in quiet amusement the first time he attempted to sing to them, his gravelly voice deep and uneven, but filled with effort. And in that moment, she realized it was never about perfection, it was about presence. And Harrison was there, more than she ever thought he would be, more than she ever thought anyone would be. One evening, as they sat on the couch, the twins sleeping soundly in their cribs nearby, Harrison turned to her. His expression was calm, but there was something serious in his gaze. "I've been thinking about something," he said. Lea looked at him curiously. "What is it?" He exhaled as if gathering his thoughts. Then, in that steady, unwavering voice of his, he said, "I want us to be a real family. Not just because of the twins, but because I want you by my side. Forever." Lea's breath caught. She knew their feelings for each other had grown. She felt the shift, the closeness, the unspoken connection between them. But hearing him say it out loud, was something else entirely. "Harrison," she murmured, her mind spinning. "This is a big step." He nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. Her fingers curled into the fabric of the couch as she tried to steady herself. "Are you sure?" she whispered. Harrison reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "Lea," he said softly, "I have never been more sure of anything in my life." And in that moment, she believed him. Harrison took her hands, his grip steady, his gaze unwavering. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "I know this won't be easy, and I know I made mistakes in the beginning." He swallowed, his expression softening as he continued. "But I want to build something with you. Something real." He took a breath before adding, "Something that's not based on contracts or obligations, but on love." His words hit her straight in the heart. Because she believed him. For the first time, there was no hesitation, no fear of what came next, only the quiet certainty that they were both ready to try. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I want that too, Harrison. Let's try." A few weeks later, the gardens of the mansion were transformed into the setting for an intimate, perfect ceremony. The sun bathed the space in golden light, a soft breeze rustling through the flowers that adorned the archway where Harrison and Lea would stand together. Only a few close people were present: Sienna, the staff who had become an important part of their journey, and of course their two little ones, dressed in the most adorable outfits imaginable. Lea wore a simple yet elegant dress, flowing softly with the wind. Harrison, ever composed, looked sharp in a tailored suit, but it wasn't the expensive fabric that made him stand out. It was the way he looked at her, like she was the only thing that had ever truly mattered. Sienna held the twins in her arms, smiling through tears of joy. And when Harrison and Lea exchanged vows, there was nothing rehearsed, nothing forced. Only truth. Harrison promised to be the man she deserved, someone who would always stand by her, no matter. Lea, in turn, promised to trust him, to believe in the man he was becoming, and to stand beside him as they built the life neither of them had ever expected. When it was over, when they stood wrapped in each other's arms, holding the twins between them, Sienna let out a quiet breath and murmured, "You make a beautiful family." And it was true. For the first time, Harrison, Lea, and their children were exactly where they were meant to be. Life after the wedding wasn't perfect. There were sleepless nights. There were mornings filled with exhaustion, days where everything seemed overwhelming, but there was also laughter. There was warmth. There was the quiet kind of happiness that didn't need grand gestures. Only the simple, undeniable truth that they had each other, Harrison and Lea learned, together, how to be parents. Harrison, who had once lived his life in rigid control, now spent nights rocking the twins to sleep, whispering lullabies in a voice that was far from melodic but filled with love. Lea, who had once feared trusting anyone, now had a home that was hers, a place where she belonged. One evening, after an especially long day, Lea was putting the twins to bed when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned just as Harrison stepped into the nursery. He didn't say anything. He just walked up to her and wrapped her in a tight embrace. Lea let out a slow breath, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, familiar heartbeat beneath his shirt. "Thank you," he murmured against her hair. "For what?" she asked, her voice soft. "For not giving up on me," she smiled, closing her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, for showing me I could trust again." Months later, on a warm and sunny afternoon, Harrison and Lea sat together in the garden, watching their twins play on a soft mat in the grass. The laughter of their children filled the air, mixing with the gentle rustling of the trees. Lea glanced at Harrison, taking in the way he was watching them, his expression filled with something deep, something pure. And in that moment, she knew. She had once believed that love was something temporary, something fragile. But this was forever. The baby's laughter rang through the garden, filling the air with pure, infectious joy. The sound was light, effortless, so small, yet so powerful. Lea turned to Harrison, who was sitting beside her, his gaze fixed on the twins as they giggled and played in the grass. For a man who once lived in control, in solitude, he looked completely at peace. And he was smiling. "Are you happy?" she asked softly, watching him carefully. Harrison glanced at her, then back at the twins before answering. "I never thought I could be this happy," he admitted, his voice steady, but full of something deep. "You've given me more than I ever knew I needed, Lea. A family, a purpose, love." Leah's heart swelled at his words. She had spent so long believing love was fleeting, something that could be taken away at any moment. But now, sitting here beside the man she had once doubted, watching their children play in the golden sunlight, she knew better. "And you've shown me that love can be built," she whispered. "Even through challenges, even when it's unexpected. Thank you for that." Harrison reached for her hand, lacing his fingers with hers. As they leaned in for a gentle kiss, a tiny voice broke through the moment. "Mama!" They both froze. "Dada," another soft babble. "Dada," Lea gasped, her eyes widening as she turned to the twins. Harrison let out a breathless laugh, something purely joyful, something Lea had never seen in him before. They both moved closer, gathering the babies in their arms, overcome with emotion. Their children had spoken their very first words. Simple and unassuming, yet carrying everything that mattered. And in that moment, as they sat together, wrapped in laughter, love, and the quiet certainty that they had found something real, Lea realized something. It wasn't a perfect life. It didn't need to be. It was theirs, full of love, full of understanding, full of hope. And that was all they needed to move forward, together. What did you think of Harrison's actions? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. How would you rate this story from 0 to 10? Let us know. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another incredible story. Want more touching stories? Click on the end screen now and let the next one move you. Let me know if you'd like any refinements.